That's
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I think we can begin. Aditi, if you can take over.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nandini Ghosh is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. Her areas of interest are qualitative research methodology, sociology of gender, marginalization, and social exclusion and social movements. She has published a monograph, Impaired Bodies, Gendered Lives, Everyday Realities of Disabled Women. She has edited a volume titled Interrogating Disability in India, Theory and Practice. She also has co-edited 2 books, Pratyaha Everyday Life Worlds, Dilemmas, Contestations and Negotiations, and Caste and Gender in Contemporary India, Power, Privilege and Politics.
Thank you. Welcome to this session of the IDSC. And this session, as you know, is titled Disability and Assertion. So basically what we are trying to look at in terms of resistance, agency, we are also looking at questions of assertion. And how do disabled people assert themselves, assert their rights, and assert even the discrimination that they suffer throughout their entire life. So we have 3 very interesting papers in this panel, and the first speaker would be Lorna Fitzsimmons, to be followed by Boopathi P and Evas Biziakova. If I don't know whether the pronunciation is right. So I would like to introduce the speakers of the session. The first speaker is Lorna. Lorna is a professor of humanities at the California State University in Los Angeles. She teaches health humanities, and the title of her paper is, to my ears, it is a language enabling resistance to ASD oppression. The next speaker would be Boopathi P, and he will be talking about From Rights to Resistance, Notes on Protest of the Blind in Post-2010 Tamil Nadu. Boopathi P teaches in the Department of English Studies, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Central University of Tamil Nadu. He holds his doctoral degree in the English and from English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. His research interests include disability studies, Palestine and West Asian literature, post-colonial and resistance literature, and life writing studies. The third speaker is Evas Biziakova. She received her PhD in translation studies from the University of Edinburgh, and she holds the post of a Rewire Research Fellow at the University of Vienna. Her current project is positioned at the intersection of translation studies and critical disability studies. She focuses on the changing depiction of disabled characters in the translated literature of the former Eastern Bloc. Her interests also include the intersection of the translation with LGBTQ issues and medical humanities. She's the author of Queering Translation History, Shakespeare's Sonnets in Czech and Slovak Transformations, which came out in 2021. And she's also the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Health. So we go into the session. We start with Lorna, then we'll take Bhupathi's paper, and finally Eva's paper. And I would like you to put the questions in the chat box, and we'll take the questions for discussion at the end. I would request the speakers to give a 15-minute presentation. At 12 minutes, I will try to give you a reminder. Lorna, will you switch on your camera and start, please? Lorna?
I don't think Lorna is here. She was here a while back.
Yeah, she said hello to me.
Yeah, but she's not here. Aditi, if you
Shall
could
we?
message her, contact her. Or Nandini ma'am, we can begin with the.
Yeah, we'll start with Boopathi then. Boopathi?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Same here. Nice to meet you.
I know you through your writings. It's
Oh.
very nice to see you here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to actually present the paper, with
Yeah.
you being a chair, actually. So, right. So,
So you
should I
start,
begin
and
now?
then when Lorna comes in, we'll talk about it.
All right. Fine.
Okay, fine.
So, I can begin now, right? Yeah. Dr. Nandini, I can begin?
Yes, you begin.
All right. So, Dr. Nandini, the chair, Professor Someshwar, the chairperson of IDSC, also the architect of this conference, and the organizing committee members, and co-presenters, and other friends. Very good afternoon to everyone. So my paper, as Nandini has read out, it is titled as "From Rights to Resistance: Notes on Protest of the Blind in Post-2010 Tamil Nadu." I have divided my paper into three sections for the better understanding. The first section, I'm actually I'll be focusing on what is the need for disability, particularly the blind, as Jagdish Chandra has very rightly put it, organized blind movement. That too in the 21st century in 2010, in post-2010. So I would be particularly locating the blind advocacy movement in Tamil Nadu. The reason why it actually became very aggressive in the post-2010 period. And the second part of my paper, I would be focusing on the four important movements which really shook the state of Tamil Nadu, and starting from 2013 one and ending with 2021 March, February precisely to put it. So this is the second focus of my part of my paper, and the third part of my paper is what is basically the nature of the mode of advocacy. Does it still remain the same? What actually the blind, or indeed through their advocacy movement, what kind of the method of their advocacy? Do they only do sit-ins and dharna, or do they also resort to some other means of reaching out to government, people, and other media and other parties? So these are the three sections of my paper today. As my title very precisely reads, I focus only on Tamil Nadu situation because the South Indian situation mostly it has not been touched upon so far with it, because we have two important scholars in disability rights movement who have chronicled the history of disability rights movement. Needless to say, people are familiar with Indian disability studies, the course, the Indian disability studies epistemology probably might be familiar. That one is probably Jagdish Chandra, who has extensively worked on history of disability rights movement. But except his one section on KFB, Kerala Federation of the Blind, in his PhD dissertation submitted at Syracuse University, he hasn't touched much on the South Indian situation. And Meenu Bombani, who also focused on disability rights movement, she also didn't touch upon the South Indian context. So the reason why I've chosen 2010 due to the fact that the after 2000, as you might know, the Tamil Nadu context, from 2006 to 2011, the state of Tamil Nadu was run by late Chief Minister Kalaignar Karunanidhi, and from 2011 till 2021, the state was run by the ADMK. Anna Dravida Munnetra Kalagam party. First, it was for 6-7 years. It was run by late Ms. Jayalalitha, then by O. Pandit, then by Edappadi K. Palaniswamy. Now, the issue is from 2006 to 11, there were countless, the legislations were passed in the state of Tamil Nadu for the welfare and development of people with disabilities, starting from the first state to start the Department of Disability Affairs, and also the first state to start the welfare board for the welfare, for the different disabled people. And the third important thing, it was actually the Kalinga, though I'm not supporting the term, but I'm just like, putting it for the record. It was Karunanidhi who actually said, basically, brought out the, legislation stating that disabled henceforth should be addressed as differently able, because disabled in Tamil, it has a very, very, culturally rooted, very, very pejorative meaning. So he brought in that term like differently able. Tamil, it is called as Matrathiranaligal. So there are like a slew of messages were actually introduced by the DMK government, and it is still, said by scholars in disability studies, also activists, particularly activists in disability activists located in Tamil Nadu. They look at 2006 to 11 as the golden period for people with the disabilities, because more than 200, 300 visually impaired people were appointed during that period as professors, school teachers, also in various government departments as employees. So after 2011, what happened was the situation of and the blind had undergone various changes, as in there was a like drastic reversal was actually happening. So primarily whatever the legislation was passed in favor of disabled in the state of Tamil Nadu were not actually in a way continued by the ADMK party. The party which actually took power in 2011 in the state of Tamil Nadu. And as a result, what happened was the College Students and Graduates Association of the Blind, on which my entire focus actually rests. So it was actually,
Boopathi, can I stop you for a minute?
Sure.
Himashri, can you please mute yourself? Yeah, Boopathi, go ahead.
Thank you, Nandini. Yeah, so after 2011, as I said, the legislation that were passed in favor of the visually impaired, in particular disabled in general, in the state of Tamil Nadu, by the the SFIL DMK government, were not actually continued, so to say, and as a result, many of the policies were dropped in the middle. And though the separate ministry was established for different disabled people in the state of Tamil Nadu, it was once again given back to the Ministry of Social Justice and midday meals by the late Ms. Jayalalitha. So now, when Kalinga was there, he had the ministry in his control. He actually, in a way, directly intervened, into the affairs of disability. So after 2011, the context completely changed, and the College Students and Graduates Association of the Blind, a body, a very strong organized, organization of the blind, which has been in existence since 1980. It's almost had more than 40 years of existence, has intervened to a great extent into the lives of visually impaired in various levels since 1980. I don't want to go into that. It requires a separate sort of paper altogether to look at the origin of blind movement in Tamil Nadu. But after 2010, the entire context, social context, socio-political, cultural, and economic context of disabled drastically changed, in a way taking a reversal stand. As a result, so the blind were forced to once again resort to a huge strike in 2013, a huge sort of a protest in 2013, particularly in September. The protest went on for more than 12 days. It started as a hunger strike. So, the major demand was, there are, first is they have to be given employment, because there seems to be a huge gap between what legislations actually say and what is practiced by the government. So legislation, as per the 1995 PWD Act, which was implemented in the state of Tamil Nadu only in 2002, exactly after 6 years, in the draft rule was formed and passed in Tamil Nadu Legislative Assembly. So, they were demanding for the backlog vacancies have to be filled. Number one. Number two, the whatever the fresh vacancies, and those vacancies do not really, in a way, cater to the disability legislation, disability reservation. So they were in a way, fighting for, putting their demands to various bodies and various government departments, various ministers, but finally nothing actually yielded. So, the kind of the pressure created by the Desfile ADMK government, also in a way a political situation that came up and that also emerged after 2010 in the state of Tamil Nadu, in a way forced them to took the streets. So what they did, as a result, they started a long sort of a hunger strike going, almost like running for, as I said earlier, more than 12 days. So they once again, in a way, resorted to their earlier sort of a protest that is like that what they have been doing since 1980. That is, to start the hunger strike. Then they will actually block the roads. They will occupy the government offices, particularly SAPD, State Commissioner for Persons with Disabilities, to seek the attention of the ministers and the Chief Minister. So there were like 5 people sat on hunger strike. Out of 5, 3 people were women. So the strike continued for more than 12 days. And finally, the late Chief Minister Jayalalitha, she said that we will actually meet all your demands. As a result, what came out was government order number 260 came out. It clearly said that, in a way, a very vague manner, they brought out the government audit, stating that the seats will be filled as and when the vacancies arise. So they said that the demand was to conduct separate teacher eligibility test for the blind people, for teachers at least till high school. For higher secondary, or what we call it as intermediate, so there has to be 200 vacancies has to be created based on backlog vacancies, and 100 vacancies have to be created for degree lecturers, particularly college professors. So the government very categorically came out with the 260 government order number 260, wherein they have mentioned that these demands will be met as and when the vacancies arise. So once again, it was some sort of in a way very tricky sort of the legislation that they brought in the Tamil Nadu Assembly. So as a result, nothing really changed. But one thing actually happened was the Tamil Nadu government, for the first time in India, they conducted special teacher eligibility test for the disabled graduates, graduates who had B.Ed. So as a result, some 50 to 80 visually impaired people were appointed all over Tamil Nadu in various schools as teachers, what we call it as BT, assistant bachelor teachers. So again, when nothing really changed except these 50, 80 appointments, they were not actually catering to the backlog vacancies. They were not aimed at filling the backlog vacancies. Only the current vacancies emerged out of, because in 2013, the government, Tamil Nadu government, appointed nearly 14,000 teachers across, Tamil Nadu for the government schools. So these 80 to 90 posts for the visually impaired as a result of those 14,000 vacancies. So these, once again, the body, that is College Students and Graduates Association of the Blind, which is a regional body pertaining to the state of Tamil Nadu. Once again, they came together. They started another very important movement in 2015 against the Tamil Nadu government. That actually protest went on for 9 days in the month of March. Asking for various demands. Again, the Tamil Nadu government came out with 3 important legislation, that is Government Order number 21 and Government Order number 107 and 108, stating that the seat will be given to the visually impaired people, but they will be first given as the temporary positions in the government-aided colleges and government colleges as guest lecturers. So once again, it was not actually, in a way, this, as I said earlier, this again a hunger strike. I think 7 people sat on hunger strike in 2015 March. I mean, the protest, as I said earlier, went up to 9 days. It was again a very serious protest. In in the 2015 protest, what happened was the police, what they, the way in which they handled was very pathetic. It actually shook the consciousness of in the entire Tamil Nadu people, also the media attention. What they did was they arrested the blind people who were protesting in the heart of the city, and they left them in the graveyard at 10 o'clock in the midnight in the night. So which is actually 15 to 20 kilometers away from the city. So they left them there, and the police came back. And the next day, it became a huge issue. And the Madras High Court came forward, and it took the case on its own, and it came out with a judgment stating that the Tamil Nadu government should frame a rule, policy, or the sort of a rule to treat the visually impaired people during the protest. I think it is for the first time it happened in the state of Tamil Nadu, if I'm not mistaken, as in Madras High Court, particularly demanding or rather instructing the Tamil Nadu government to frame a policy for conducting the visually impaired people during the protest. So going back due to the lack of time, I'm just moving on further. In 2018, there was again a very strong protest, which actually continued for 3 days, and it ended when they met the then Chief Minister Boopathi P. The actually movement went for 3 days, that is March 5, 6, and 7, 3 days, and they handed over him a lot of demands. Though the demands, perhaps we can actually categorize their demands into 3 levels. One is for the students, college students. Second is for the blind unemployed graduates. Third is for the blind people who are working in Tamil Nadu government service. So, the 3 days the movement went again. It started as a hunger strike, as their protest method actually goes. But in this protest, what happened was they started using WhatsApp and other the features that are there in the smartphone. Because earlier they used to go to separate hostels, and they used to form a protest committee. The committee member will go to the hostels and take the people. But in this protest, particular in 2018, what happened was they used the WhatsApp quite largely through their voice note and everything, informing them when the next particular protest will be, where they had to assemble tomorrow, next day. All these things they were actually communicating. So now in 2021, the last protest, which happened very recently, which started in February 17, ended in March 1st, 2021. With 20 demands, by the College Students and Graduates Association of the Blind, and almost it went on for more than almost 13 days. All 13 days they occupied State Commissioner for Persons with Disabilities, and none of the officials actually met them. So here they started adapting different sort of method. One is, so they started using their own YouTube channels, because as you know, it's very difficult to get the media attention, that too for the visually impaired protest, because you should also understand that during this period that Tamil Nadu government, Tamil Nadu state was preparing for election. So in March 17, the election date was on, not 17, I think it was in 24, yes. February 24, the election date was announced. And then also the protest continued for, I think, another 5 days or so. So the Tamil Nadu, in a way, the government did not bother much about these people this time, because anyway the government is actually it's going to vacate its office, because the election date was announced and all this thing. Then also the visually impaired did not give up their thing. And as I said earlier, they used technology to a great extent this time. The first thing that they used was they immensely used YouTube channels. So many visually impaired people, they are running their own YouTube channels. They did not, this time, they did not actually rely on mainstream media. Usually they used to go to the mainstream media office and ask them to cover their story. This time they did not do so. Instead, they were covering media, the protest in their own YouTube channels and reaching out to so many people, putting it on Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, and all these things. And second important thing is the the protest videos were widely shared in the WhatsApp, and there's a magazine exclusively, online magazine exclusively run by the visually impaired, for the visually impaired, titled Viral Moliyar, basically the language of fingers. So it can be roughly translated as into English. So they started writing widely in that particular magazine, starting talking about what actually, how they were treated by the state commissioner, how they were treated by the officials, police, public, and everything. They started writing. So these these are the four important protests that happened in the post 2010 Tamil Nadu. And another important thing is, if you could, going by Jagdish Chandra's, writings, also Meenu Bambani's work, these, be it is NFB, ASAB, all these blind, mainstream blind organizations, let me put it, national level blind organizations, they, these days, they do not actually go to the streets. They do not go to the roads. They do not, in a way, take out a protest like, Dharna or, hunger strike and all these things. They are basically fighting in the courtrooms. Courtrooms like High Court or like Supreme Court, or be it is like CCPD court, whatever it is. Basically, they are focusing more on the advocacy part of it rather than on the activist part of it. But this organization, they resort to their major mode of protest is actually three levels. Major one is the hunger, activism in the true sense of the term. I think it is like blocking the roads, occupying the SCPD office, the hunger strike and all these things. Second important thing is they are also, like doing advocacy in terms of filing cases in the Madras High Court. They have won so many cases. Currently I think 3 cases are being, are continuing in the Madras High Court. One is for the reservation in the government aided schools. Second is the reservation for visually impaired in government aided institutions, and third is in the state universities. And in, through the slew of letters submitted to government of, the chief minister cell, meeting the chief minister, meeting the ministers. So that level also, that is what primarily I categorize into ground level, legal level, that is fighting in the courtroom and filing petitions in the chief minister office or chief secretariat office and all these things. And the third important is primarily that is important for us because we are concerned with academics. They also do their protest, they register their protest and they register their activism in the academics also. What actually, NFB did it in 1973 and 1974. Like Kenneth Jenigan delivered 2 important, remarkable, talks. One is in 1972, he delivered a talk titled "Blindness is History Against Us." 1973, he delivered another important talk titled "Blindness is Literature Against Us." So this organization also, they organized 2 important national level conference. One is on the empowerment and future challenges of visually impaired in 2019, wherein they invited papers from visually impaired people. They asked them to present it in the their annual day program. They had a national conference in that as part of their annual day celebration. Second, in 2020, they continued the second national level conference they organized titled "Blind in India, Art, Culture and Resistance," wherein they documented, how they basically look at resistance, how they look at literature. So, the papers basically focused on the, the situation of blind in the representation of, or the rather politics of representation of blind in literature, culture, particularly in Tamil context, also, art. So these three levels, I think they are protesting. So finally, to conclude, I particularly look at the protest of the blind in 2010 Tamil Nadu, not merely as a stereotypical, hunger strike or, the taking the road or something. As I said earlier, this protest, there are many protests that they've conducted in post 2010 can be categorized into three levels. That is, as I mentioned earlier, ground level and legal level and academic levels. So I think it is important for us to also, in a way, chronicle and the document such protests and see how the activist or the activist bodies are also turning towards, in a way, academia. They not only in a way protest in the street or courtroom, they also generate knowledge, from the perspective of activists. So I'll stop it here. Probably if there is any question, I'll take it up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Boopathi. It was a real pleasure listening to you. I really like the two things that you brought out in this paper. One is this entire difference between advocacy and activism, and how different levels groups engage either with activism or with advocacy, or sometimes they are doing it at a larger level of only awareness generation and advocacy, and not doing activism, which is more grassroots level. The other point is what you concluded with, whether looking at these three levels of protest, the ground level ones, the legal activism that we see, and the academic critique that we produce of what is going on in this country. So this is very important also in a certain way to look at this kind of things. Boopathi, we will take the questions for you in the discussion later. So I will request anyone who has questions for Boopathi to put it in the chat box. I will take note of it and I will bring it up in the question answer session. I will now like to invite Eva to present her paper. Eva, are you here?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay. Thank you very much. Greetings from Austria. It's still morning here. Thank you so much for having me at this conference. I'm learning so much with all of you. I'll share my screen and hopefully no technical issues will come up. There we are. Good. I'm sorry. There we go. Is the screen there?
Yes, we can see it, Eva.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So as was already told in the introduction in my bio, I come from translation studies. So that's my sort of main area. And the thing that I'm currently doing in my project here in Vienna is to try to introduce disability studies into translation studies, where so far there has been very little overlap. A collected volume from Professor Sati and others is so far one of the very few that exist within this field. And I would very much like to support sort of disability studies to be a part of translation studies, because I think that the sort of linguistic transfer between languages and within a language can tell us a lot about how we view disability and also how it changes meaning across various cultural borders. I'm working on a larger project which has to do with literature, and this is a smaller project that I'll be presenting today. It's still work in progress, so I'm very much open to questions and comments and feedback. And this one is where I'm looking at how disability activism crosses with climate change activism, and how all of those are influenced by translation, both intralingual, so within a language where we translate from, say, a medical text into newspaper articles, and then the interlingual, so between various languages. So I'm sure many of you know about the whole problem or the whole issue that has been highlighted a couple of years back. There was a viral video with a sea turtle with a plastic straw stuck in its nose. And a couple of years later, all of that escalated through a lot of well-meaning, let's call it well-meaning activism, to things like Starbucks eliminating plastic straws globally by 2020, replacing them with cups that can't be recycled, but that's beside the point, all the way to actual large systemic changes, such as the EU actually banning single-use plastic since June 2021. So as we speak, the EU where I live has banned the use of single-use plastic. So nowhere in restaurants will you be actually given a plastic straw. I had a quick look. I'm obviously not an expert, but from what I understand, India should be having a similar legislation coming soon in July 2022. So there will be similar changes coming up. Of course, I'm used to presenting this to translation studies audiences, so it's much easier for me to explain these things because all of you, of course, know why completely banning plastic straws is incredibly dangerous, because a lot of people, for various reasons with various impairments, need plastic straws in order to be able to drink safely in public places. And also why, again, well-meaning comments like, why can't they just bring a straw with them, or why can't they get straws from the pharmacy, are just completely missing the point, because it's once again bringing the onus of the burden of accessibility onto people who are already incredibly marginalized and who find it incredibly difficult to be included in public life, in things like cafes and restaurants and everything else. So the table that you see is part of this project. This is a very useful sort of tool to explaining to usually non-disabled people why the whole plastic straw thing is such a huge thing. And I've seen this table actually translated into various languages, and part of this project is me looking at the sort of pathways of how these arguments or how these points are being shifted through various languages and presented to various audiences. But today I would like to speak about a very particular case study where we're looking at the other side of the coin. So how some of the more harmful language associated with climate change disability is spreading through both intralingual and interlingual translation. So we're starting with this is a journal article from BMJ Open, that's the British Medical Journal. And this was originally a very simple article called Costs of Switching to Low Global Warming Potential Inhalers. And basically what was happening is a group of scientists decided to see what would happen if NHS, that's the British National Health Service, which is covering most of the free healthcare in the UK, what would happen if they would switch to a different type of inhaler, how much money could be saved, and also on the side, how this would be better for the environment because the other type of inhaler has a lower carbon footprint. So the results of the study are as follows. If MDIs, that's metered dose inhalers, they are the usual ones that you see where you push a button and there is an aerosol spray which propels the active ingredient into the respiratory system. Using this is hydrofluoroalkyne, I think, propellant would be replaced with the cheapest equivalent DPI. These are dry powder inhalers. So as the title suggests, this is a powder instead of an aerosol. Then for every 10% of these metered dose inhalers changed to dry powder ones, the drug costs would decrease by 8.2 million annually. Now, of course, it's important to know that not all people are able to use the DPIs. They are not for everyone. So, of course, there wouldn't be a complete switch, which is one of the reasons why the study suggested this would be just, a 10% change. So some people could be switched by the NHS to a different type of inhaler. But obviously, there would be a very large saving, which was the original aim of the article, to show how much money could be saved. On the side, however, there was also, of course, the climate change aspect. And one of the results was that changing one MDI device to DPI could save 150 to 400 kilos CO2 annually. And in order to illustrate this, they say this is roughly equivalent to installing wall insulation at home, recycling, or cutting out the meat. These are individual actions that many environmentally concerned individuals are keen to take. And indeed, the authors also stress that patients care about the carbon footprint of their inhalers. One survey of inhaler users found that 78% rated carbon footprint as important, equally important to them as financial cost. And they cite another article which was looking at how people choose inhalers and what is the priority for people who have the choice to find some. And of course, the original article also very rightly points out that climate change is a huge and present threat to health, which will disproportionately impact the poorest and most vulnerable on the planet, including people with pre-existing lung disease. I have to say that this whole setting is pre-COVID times. So, pre-existing lung disease wasn't as horribly scary term as it has become in the intervening 2 years. So as I said, the article was very, very clear in saying that this is a change that is good for everyone, both the climate and the finances, and that people who are using these inhalers themselves are very, very aware of the threat of climate change to their own health. So this was the original article, and let's now have a look at how was this reported in the press. So we're going the intralingual translation from a very specific medical article, which has terminology and has a very specific audience, to the same text translated for the wider public. So for people who want to know what is going on in science. Unsurprisingly, this is the BBC News. Asthma carbon footprint as big as eating meat. Now, of course, I understand that news outlets need to have clicks and need to engage readers. And of course, the headlines will have to be attention grabbing. But to pick from the whole article, which was talking about so many important and positive things about how we can save money and do something good for the environment by having this relatively small change, to pick out of that the whole point of it was that asthma inhalers are bad for the environment and that they are as bad as eating meat. I find it quite callous, as I'm sure you will agree. The choice of words, again, to say that asthma carbon footprint, as if asthma as a thing, as an illness, as a condition, had a carbon footprint of its own, that's just, I don't know, that just really sits very badly with me. At this point, it's a good reminder that the term carbon footprint was invented by British Petroleum, so BP, in order to persuade people that the fact that the planet is dying is not their fault as a huge company, creating unspeakable amounts of CO2, but it's our fault because we didn't recycle that one yogurt tub after breakfast. So continuing with the news, this is Sky News, asthma inhalers as bad for the environment as eating meat. So again, picking up that one little tiny detail and saying that indeed asthma inhalers are bad for the environment. So they are the horrible thing that is, in this whole conversation that is really at fault. It's not just the big news, it's things like Climate News Network, climate threats from inhalers can prove costly. Again, the choice of words, threat from inhalers, as if the inhalers themselves are threatening climate and our planet. It's just something very thoughtless about the choice of these words. Then we have Mail Online, which, if you don't know, this is a classic tabloid, so they're they're not known for their objectivity, but they are, funnily enough, one of the least biased ones because they are using a previous study. So switching asthma patients to green inhalers could slash carbon emissions by 58 tons a year. This is citing a previous study, which is completely unrelated to this one, but at least they understand the point that switching asthma patients to a green inhaler could not just, save money, but also contribute to the planet. A very interesting example is here. This is Time, which has, when you look into their archives, I have how one commonly used asthma inhaler is damaging the planet. Now, personally, I really don't like the damaging the planet already. It's, the image of an asthma inhaler stomping on the face of the whole earth. But when you look into their archives on Twitter, you find this. So this is the article, and there's an editor's note. The original headline on this video has been updated to clarify that it is one commonly used type of inhaler, not all inhalers, that emit significant greenhouse gases. Now, I was curious because I didn't really believe that such a small change necessitated a whole change of a headline. And indeed, when you look into their YouTube archives, you find out that the original headline, you can see down here, how asthma inhalers are choking the planet. And whoever came up with that horrible pun, I have like just no words how horrible a pun that is, really. And it's very clear that there was a huge backlash on Twitter, which is why the Time decided to change the headline and not talk about inhalers choking the planet. Of course, not all newspapers are terrible at telling people stories, and we have positive ones. So there is the Washington Post, which is very clearly referencing the original Time article, saying no, asthma inhalers are not choking the planet. And they also include this very handy graphic, which is showing that, when you take it in perspective, the inhalers are such an absolutely tiny factor in all of these emissions debate that it's really not worth talking about it. There is also an article from Grist about the irony of blaming inhalers for climate change, which I find finally somebody picked up on the fact that, it's people who will suffer the most with the climate change that are blamed for using life-saving devices. So that's the Anglophone news. And now I wanted to see what happens when these news cross the linguistic borders and get reported somewhere else. And I was working primarily with German, and you'll always see the back translation on the right-hand side. So first of all, we have, this is Ärzteblatt.de, which is a German medical journal, which is reporting changing to environmentally friendly asthma inhalers could sink CO2 emissions and costs, which to me is the most... So this is for me the most measured response to the original article, because it's very much summing up what actually happened. But of course, it's not all plain sailing. Next one is Halpraxis. Asthma sprays let loose massive amounts of greenhouse gas. The word Unmengen that they're using means, Menge means amount, and Un is a prefix for so unspeakable amounts of greenhouse gases. So instead of comparisons with meat eaters, we now have this image of every single time you press the little button of your inhaler, huge amounts of greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere and are choking the planet. Similarly, we have health news. Asthma sprays contaminate the air with masses of greenhouse gases. And the word contaminate here is for pest, and pest is the plague. So they plague the air with huge amounts of greenhouse gases. Again, the sort of poisonous clouds in the atmosphere every time you press a button on an inhaler. And my personal favorite from all of these is from the Austrian newspaper Kurier, which says, as harmful as eating meat, asthma inhalers as climate sinners. And there's just something so insidious about the whole Catholic imagery of a sinner, of somebody, of doing something so terrible that it's very unpardonable by literally using a life-saving device that I just find just fascinating. So that's the overview. As I said, this is still work in progress. So I'm still looking at other means of following all of these threads, and also looking into other languages and what was the backlash against these, because there was quite a strong one, especially again on Twitter, on social media, etc., etc. Now, as I said, of course, I understand that newspapers have to have attention-grabbing headlines, especially now in the digital age, where each of the clicks is, of course, more engagement. And of course, sometimes there is a conscious effort to make the headlines as controversial as possible, because the more engagement we gain, or newspapers gain, the better for them. But there is, of course, a line between, having attention-grabbing headlines and presenting articles in a way that is actively harmful to disabled people. And again, we know this isn't such a big deal, but we all know that both in the previous years since climate change became a larger subject, and with, of course, COVID-19 and everything else that's been happening in the past few years, there has been a huge rise of what we call ecofascism. So a lot of people who think that, the planet is overcrowded, and the way to limit the number of people is to get rid of, well, we know whom they think should be get rid of. So I think that the way we talk about these things is incredibly important, and we need to be more mindful about how we present news, and especially translators who are processing these news and who are creating these headlines and who are, taking these articles and creating something else out of them need to be more mindful about what their words can cause. One last disclaimer, because I was told this previously, I do not, of course, think that everybody who is sort of fighting climate change is automatically a horrible ableist person. I know that this is a tiny minority of people who have these thoughts in terms of ecofascism and everything else, but it's still a thing that we need to take into account, that we cannot have one huge movement to save the planet and completely, discount the needs of some of the most vulnerable parts of population. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Eva. It was indeed, eye-opener for me at least, because you don't realize what kind of research or what kind of media attention is given. Even research studies and their findings are disseminated in such ways, which kind of reinforce the negative images that what we were talking about yesterday when we were doing the inaugural. We were talking about how disabled people are almost always portrayed in a negative manner. And so it's the same thing that happens here, where, medical research is coming out with, say, options for allowing disabled people to live fuller lives. And then yet these interventions are interpreted as being negative or harming the environment. So if climate change, environmental degradation are big things now. So, against them, how disabled people get, caught up in this entire discourse of what is better and what is shouldn't be there, what shouldn't be there. So it was really interesting, Eva. Is Lorna here by any chance?
No, she's not joined back. We've sent her an email, but there has been no response.
Okay. So shall we take some questions? For people who can type into the chat box, I would request you to put in your questions, comments in the chat box. Boopathi and Eva, can you please switch on your camera so that you are visible? And we'll take the questions, comments. For anyone who is not able to put it in the chat box, please raise your hand and we'll get back to you. So, Boopathi, there was a previous comment, Kaustubh Kashyap. He says that two facts can be inferred from your presentation. First, protest by blind people leading to new forms of legislation and their use of media like YouTube to disseminate their situation. How can we make this advocacy more impactful so we can cut through the red tape and bureaucracy?
Yeah, so to answer this question, actually, yes, it's good that the blind people are resorting to various levels of media which are owned by themselves. They don't actually rely on other things. But I don't think it's going to change, or it's going to in any way alter the red tape that is actually prevalent in the government offices and other things, because at the end of the day, you can only at the most disseminate to the public, right? So it cannot, mere dissemination cannot translate to become a legislation. Even we have a lot of legislation. Legislation clearly says that, a 4% reservation have to be given to the disabled people, at least from 2017 onwards, right? And like 3% has to be percent reservations have to be given to the disabled people. It is there, like it has been there since 1995, at least in national level. In Tamil Nadu, it has been there since 1981, the year in which the government order number 602 was in a way passed in Tamil Nadu Legislative Assembly, but nothing has been materialized. So at the most, we can use our own media, like, be it Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is, the social media, to reach out to the public, to voice our concerns, make the public understand that, the state of disabled is not the way they expect. It's not the way they actually know. It is in a way opposite to what is actually being projected and what is the reality. Right? So it is opposite to the the projection. The reality is much more haunting. But these are the things that can actually we can tell it to the people through the media. But one thing I agree with you. The red tape as in to reaching out to the mainstream media, it has completely gone now, because from 2021, the March February month protest, what we could understand is that because people used the blind people, they used their Facebook, they used their Twitter, they tagged chief minister, they tagged the minister, they tagged everybody. They could do that. Earlier it was not possible, right? Because at the technology not being there, I don't think this sort of the reaching out would have really happened. But but to put it, but I don't think anything can be done with this sort of what you call a medium in the government office level. It's all rest in the sort of legislators. It's all rest in the officers to basically listen to us. And most of for your information, what is actually happening in the state of Tamil Nadu, I can tell you very confidently. The state commissioner for persons with disabilities, that particular post is seen as a punishment post. So, for example, somebody is actually has to be punished. Any IAS officer has to be punished. The first thing the government will do, irrespective of DMK government or IDMK government or any government in the state of Tamil Nadu, they will transfer the person to the the commissioner office. He will be the commissioner for persons with disabilities, right? Or he will be the secretary of Department of differently abled welfare. Right? So this is how it is being practiced, and the people, they don't even stay there for 6 months. They are constantly transferred, and they literally know nothing about disability legislations, disability rights. So you need to, in a way, first educate those people. Then after they are educated, when they start doing something, they'll be transferred to some other department. This is what is being happening. So, yeah.
Yeah, indeed, this is true, Boopathi. The posting in the disability department across states is seen as a punishment posting. And we hardly get full-time commissioners anyway. In West Bengal, it is also the same scenario. We do not get a full-time commissioner. We get always a additional charge commissioner.
Exactly.
So he's in charge of something else and he has an additional charge of disability. Eva, there's
another. May I add something?
Yeah.
Also, another pathetic thing, both in the national level, also in the state level, in India, what is happening is, for example, women commissioner is women. SC/ST commissioner is somebody from the particular community. But in the case of disabled, except Pincha, right? So no one is a person from the disability community is appointed as the commissioner, both in the state level, also in the national level. So This is once again a very pathetic. Thank you.
True. There's a comment for Eva. It says that it seems like journalism is working with an ableist capitalist agenda, and language sensitivity to asthma inhalers has been lost. What do you suggest as an alternative form of resisting this, since it operates in such a mainstream level? Will language choice be enough? And he really liked your presentation. Again, this is Kaustav Kashyap. He really liked your presentation because it was unique and an angle that he did not notice.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. I never know whether to see these articles as a, evil capitalist propaganda, or just the newspapers genuinely not caring or not realizing how harmful they are. And I do not know which one is scarier of those two, because, okay, that aside, I think, as was already said in this session, I think using social media is just one of the very few things that we can do. And because of the way social media is structured, it gives us incredible power to for articles to get viral, to really fight back, to highlight issues. And yet it's a type of ephemeral tool, in the sense that most of these things will sort of die down after a while. But there is incredible power in, Twitter and spreading information and really, as I said, making things viral and commenting on things. So I think really the only thing is just to remain vocal, to remain engaged and to fight back against these sort of articles. As I said, when I was looking through Twitter and also other comments, but mostly on Twitter, there were so many disappointed voices and so many people were pushing against this. And as you see with the Time article, there was so much backlash that actually something has changed. And I know that in many ways it feels like it, losing battle. And I'm from Slovakia originally. I'm now living in Austria, and I see how the whole disability system just doesn't work in either of those countries. So I know that it feels sometimes very discouraging, but I always try to remember how much social change has come before us and how much, women in universities and the changes in language in terms of queer people and everything else. And I just really think that with enough push, we can make a difference. I think there has been a lot of, in terms of public backlash, I'm not sure if this has been discussed in our panels, but when COVID started, there was in the UK, there was a huge backlash against the daily briefings because they didn't have sign language interpreting. And it was so powerful that they actually admitted that, yes, this was a mistake, and yet they started adding these. So again, and this was something that went mostly through social media and mostly through people complaining and forwarding the complaints, and also obviously talking to their friends about the problem and making it more and more visible. So I think that's really the only thing that we can do, is just to remain angry. That's all that we can do. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Yeah, I think this. I think disabled people in this country really have to become angry. Most of the time in India, the fact that there is so much of negative socialization, so much of internalization of a negative identity, that disabled people hardly ever think of getting angry, because if you get angry, then that's another negative side. So you would rather not be a cynosure of all eyes kind of a thing. And that is very important. I mean, if I if I think in a certain way, the fact that language itself can be so disabling. And in India, we have so many languages. Each language, each dialect has its own coinages that disables. And then you have this kind of a larger media footprint that, uses such disabling imagery and tries to, again, put the blame back onto the disabled people for seeking the kind of interventions. And this is where I think it is very important maybe to call out the media, maybe to, now borrowing from what Boopathi was saying, using the social media to counter some of these media messages. Maybe that is another campaign that really needs to be run in terms of advocacy. Is there any other questions? Are there any hands up? Any response from Lorna? I'm really sorry, she was here right on time.
No, unfortunately, we've not been able to contact her. She's
Okay. So, any other questions? Anyone would like to speak out here in this session? We still have a little bit of time. So, we can take another 10-15 minutes to discuss if required. Fine. So since people are not setting the ball rolling, I have a question, Boopathi, because you have studied the blind people's movement so clearly in Tamil Nadu. And we know Tamil Nadu has a very vibrant disabled people's movement also. The DPOs are very strong. They are very vocal about their issues. They do a lot of street level protests, because that is where the visibility increases, I think. So in that kind of a scenario, Boopathi, when you talk about these blind people's assertions, I would also like to know whether, blind people's groups are also linking up with other single disability groups or the cross disability groups, to highlight each other's issues, because the more people you have, the more significantly you can focus on your issues.
Yes, yes, it's a very good question, actually, Nandini. There are actually two important cross-disability, groups operating in Tamil Nadu very vibrantly. One is titled All Types of Disabled Group. All types of disabled group organizations called Anithu Ulaga Maatruthirunaligal. Basically means Anithu Thara Maatruthirunaligal. So all types of disabled group movement. Second is called the December 3 movement. It's by run by Deepak Nathan, who is also an assistant professor at Loyola College. It is also a very vocal movement. So these, apart from that, there are, other types of movements are also there. Like those are very the impairment specific movement. But the question is like whether this, as far as CSDB is concerned, like ASCB, NFB, they don't want, and I've been talking to them also. I also spoke to them. Why can't you, in a way, join hands with December 3 or this group, or even this all types of disabled group movement? They said that again, Jenny again and other people, the typical, the impairment specific movement. They say that they don't want to go with the sort of the other group, stating that basically their number one, their demands will be in a way lost in the other things, because they think that but what is happening, in other words, is that they fight, and other people, they are no, whatever they're getting, it is also reaching out to other people also. But it is better if they join with other group. But the problem is like what ASCB and NFB, they have, they kind of an argument, they don't want to go with other thing. They want their voice to be unique. Their problems are different. They don't believe in cross disability movement. So these are certain, in a way, inherent problems that have been there. I think you also know this, the kind of a problem that have been there since, at least since 1990, when, NCPDP started by, the Javed Abidi, in the beginning, early 1990s, when Javed Abidi started it, many, AACB or NFB did not join, hands with Javed Abidi. Though though these cross disability organizations also having visually impaired members, they have large number of visually impaired members. The kind of the issues that they speak, they also speak about the accessibility for visually impaired. They also speak about the issues faced by visually impaired. But I don't know, this problem, it has been there, like they're not actually joining hands. But those organizations are not very, though they are vocal, but they are not very vocal, so to say, when we compare it with the CSDB, College Students and Graduates Association of the Blind. Because as far as I know, I myself have observed so far, at least from 2010, which is the point of discussion here. So there are like 4 major protests. You just, type it on Google, protest of disabled in Tamil Nadu. Mostly you will get, the stories on blind movements only. But it's not to deny the fact that other organizations, other DPOs are not really fighting for their rights, or not asserting their rights. They have been asserting, but somehow, as you know, in the national level also, these things are becoming very, in a way, they visually impaired, they've been, protesting it. But these days, yes, we have NPRD, we have NCPDP also coming up very openly, but NPRD is much more vocal when we compare to other, the disabled organizations or impairment specific organizations also. Yeah, I think this problem is there. It's a very good question, but yes, this is an inherent problem with these impairment specific organizations. But somehow they are not able to, in a way, converge at the point, where they can assert their disability identity rather than impairment specific. I think that's a serious, really, a problem. And that problem is there even in the West also. When we look at other disability, the books on disability rights movement in the West, like for example, Joseph P. Shapiro's one and other things also. And mostly, in the West, it's they also have the impairment specific organizations, specific movements. But yeah, this problem is there in Tamil Nadu also. It's no exception to that, the state of Tamil Nadu. Yeah, so good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Boopathi. I think, Eva, there are a couple of questions for you. I'll just read them out. Okay, so the first one is from Srinjoy Datta.
It's from Someshwar, sir. I've written it for him. It's from Someshwar, sir.
Okay, sorry, it's Someshwar's question. Since you come from the domain of translation studies, do you see translation as a form of social activism? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, and yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, I'm very passionate about translation as a okay, we talk about invisible translators, but it's very much an invisible force to me because so much in our world is translated, especially with the hegemony of Anglophone everything. And then each of us is speaking a different language or languages, and we're translating in our own heads and through daily reading all the time. And yes, translation has incredible impact that we just do not usually see. It's both the choice of words, but I think in terms of activism, it's even more important to look at what gets translated, why the choice of certain articles versus others. It's also who does the translating and for which purpose, how it gets distributed and everything else. And especially with things like activism, it's very, usually it's very, again, Anglo-centric in the sense that we get all these words like ableism and everything else from English. And it's very interesting to see how these words trickle down into individual languages. At the moment, my own mother tongue, which is Slovak, doesn't have a word for ableism. So we use just a phonetic version of ableismus. But it's interesting to compare it to German when there is a original word which is more like the phobia of disabled people, so Behindertenfeindlichkeit. But it's a different word from ableism. So there's a question, should these two words come together or not? And again, usually because these things trickle down through news and blog posts, very often it won't be even professional translators, however we define the term, who are translating these things and which then are sort of passed down into sort of general public. So I do think observing the pathways of translation and especially asking who translates and what sort of, not just the gender, but also what sort of education they have is very, very important. And that's, again, why we need to be more mindful of these things and why not just, disabled community, but everyone should be mindful of the language they're using.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. There's another question by Krishna. She says she liked your presentation and thought what I inferred from it is that you're working at the intersection of disability studies, translation studies, and environmental studies. I want to know if people working in the allied fields are sensitive to the implication of language use regarding disability.
So from the perspective of translation studies, I would say it's very slowly starting. Translation studies is a relatively new field. We started in the 1990s, and there were several waves of different sort of subcategories being incorporated. So I worked previously in LGBTQ+ or gender studies, and there is a very visible shift of how people started thinking from a gendered perspective about translations, both in a very sort of disruptive way, but also in sort of everyday just translation processes of how people are more mindful about things like pronouns and everything else. And it's a very slow shift with incorporating sort of things related to disability, especially in the medical humanities field or in general, just translation for the medical fields, because that's a large part, especially in terms of interpreting. I would say it's coming very slowly, and I would very much like to be one of the people who push it forward for people to be more mindful. Another thing I would like to do is just to make translation studies conferences more accessible, which is, again, something that we haven't really considered until now too much because, well, it's a whole subject, but I would very much like that to be also a thing. Obviously, sign language interpreting is a large part of translation studies, so that's stands at the intersection of translation and disability studies even more than anything else. But yeah, it's trickling down slowly and hopefully.
There's another question from Kostab. I would like to know a little more about another question from Someshwar before I go on to Kostab's question. What role do you think the conscious choice of words plays in shaping mindsets, particularly ableist ones?
I would say it's incredibly important. I know this is again a discussable subject, like does language create how we think about the world, or does the world create language? But I firmly think that once you start seeing certain things, it completely changes once you start talking about things in a certain way, it completely changes your mindset. It's very similar to, again, gender studies where I worked previously, where once you start noticing the just sort of inherent sexism in most languages, you can't unsee it. And it was the same for me once I started working with disability studies, that I started realizing just how internalized all of this language is in all of us, and how, you know, the narratives are so deep in the language that we use that it's incredibly difficult to get rid of them. As an example, in English at the moment, using the word invalid is, you know, frowned upon. It's not used anymore. But my language, Slovak, uses the word invalid for naming the benefits for disabled people, and there is just no equivalent. And there are attempts to find something else, but it's still there, and it very much perpetuates the whole image of, you know, invalid, and it's everything that comes along with it. So I do think that, yes, using specific language, whether we want to call it political correctness or not, does make a huge difference. And I do think that we need to make a conscious choice to both use language, for us to use language that is that isn't perpetuating harmful stereotypes, but also to perhaps, when we can, call out other people, whether it's just our family members or friends, to make them aware that, you know, the way you speak about these things, like wheelchair bound and, you know, things like that, it's just, it really is harming people. And yes, it's a small thing and people can complain, it's just, you know, too much of political correctness, but it makes a change. I firmly believe that, yes, these make a huge difference.
There's someone, Costa, who would like to know what medical humanities is about. Is it akin to disability studies? I mean, do you have any experience of this?
Yeah, so very broadly said, medical humanities is looking at medicine, not from the medical point of view, but from the, not just social, but also from the cultural, historical perspective. So what do we mean when we say health? When did the concept of health come from in different countries? It meant different things at different points in time. How do narratives in literature, not just in medical literature, but also, say, fiction, influence the way we think about human bodies and functionality or illness or death and things like that? So it's very much sort of using the lenses from humanities, which is, among other things, thinking about language, thinking about culture, social norms, thinking about what we use when we talk about certain concepts, and applying them onto the medicine. So it sort of straddles between medicine and humanities, as the title suggests. So looking at how we talk about body and illness and health.
Okay, great. Great. So I don't think there are any other questions or comments. There are none in the chat box. So as the chair, it's my privilege now to sum up this session before we draw it to an end. I would like to really point out in summation the two papers that were presented here. They are very seemingly disparate. Because one talks of how the media portrays medical conditions, with disabling medical conditions, and how blame is put on the persons with disabilities for using certain kinds of products, creating again a negative imagery around disability and use of these rehabilitative measures. The other paper was something that was looking overtly at the question of assertion by blind people's groups in Tamil Nadu, and how they were able to influence. How they were able to influence, say, government action or not influence it. So there's a they seem to be two very disparate papers, but there is a very clear link of, you know, how certain kind of certain language is used to make claims, and these claims need to be questioned by disabled people and activists within disability sector, where we really question how language is being used to disable further. And there is therefore a need for assertion in a certain way. On the other hand, Bhoopathi's paper, which was clearly about assertion, raises further questions about how these assertions, the extent to which they are effective, the way in which they could be probably made more effective, and the fact that the assertions that are being made by a single disability group are not able to somehow build the bridges with other groups and other disability movements. So there is a very clear way in which, assertion, activism, advocacy, and it relates to the entire concept of resistance. How do we resist? How do we resist language that is disabling, language that is creating, again, negative images about disability and disabled people? And how do we resist policies and practices that are there in the community? And herein, I think that the other common thread that emerges, I think, very clearly is, while we are looking at, say, medical interventions, or we are looking at policy interventions, we have not been able to really influence and change the mindsets of people who portray this kind of a disabling imagery, of a negative imagery. And that is the point I think we should be able to take away from this session. The fact that how do we use media, social media, more proactively to talk about positives of disabled people, to resist the negative imagery that is being promoted across cultures, across countries, and across disability groups. So thank you for a very interesting session, Eva and Boopathi. I'm really sorry that Lorna couldn't join us, but it was really a very interesting session. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nandini. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, for chairing the session and for this very concise summation. I would also like to thank the presenters, Eva and Boopathi, for such fantastic and engaging presentation.